June 3, 1944, Portsmouth, England. The wind howled across the English Channel like a living thing. Sheets of rain slammed against the steel hulls of ships waiting in endless lines, their decks slick with salt and anticipation. In a darkened operations tent near the harbor, Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Eoris Hughes, a Welsh civil engineer turned military planner, stood over a set of drawings so ambitious that even his colleagues had once called them lunacy. On the paper before him was a plan to build an entire harbor not on land, but on the open sea. Outside, the rumble of trucks echoed through the fog as soldiers loaded prefabricated steel sections, floating roadways, massive concrete caissons, and pontoon bridges, each labeled with coded designations: Phoenix, Whale, Spud. To most of the men handling them, these were just strange pieces of metal and concrete. Few understood that these odd shapes would soon form one of the most extraordinary engineering feats of the war: the Mulberry Harbors. Hughes lit a cigarette, watching the smoke curl toward the canvas ceiling. Behind him, an American officer, Colonel Ralph E. Toe of the U.S. Navy's CB construction battalions, adjusted his rain-soaked cap. "You really believe we can float a port across the channel?" Toe asked, his voice half in disbelief, half in awe. "Not believe," Hughes replied quietly. "We must. Without it, the beaches will drown in men and machines that can't move forward." For months, Allied planners under Winston Churchill's directive, the transportation of ports concept, had wrestled with a brutal logistical truth. Even if the invasion of France succeeded, the absence of deep-water ports could strangle the advance. Cherbourg was too heavily defended, and Calais too obvious a target. The only solution was to bring the port with them. Now, just days before Operation Overlord, the pieces lay scattered across England's southern coast. Thousands of tons of floating steel, reinforced concrete, and human determination. And time was running out. June 5th, 1944, Southampton dockyards. The gray dawn carried the scent of oil and seawater as convoys of tugboats, barges, and transport ships stretched out across the horizon. Engineers and sailors moved among them like ants on a colossal, secret machine. Each vessel carried a piece of the impossible, one section of a floating harbor that would soon anchor the invasion of Western Europe. The Allies had given the project a simple code name, Operation Mulberry, but there was nothing simple about it. In the final weeks before D-Day, British and American engineers working from Garlieston, Scotland, to Portsmouth had assembled nearly 500,000 tons of prefabricated steel and concrete. They had tested floating roadways in the Solway Firth, watched giant caissons rise like gray tombs from the depths, and argued over every bolt, hinge, and anchor chain. The British called the massive hollow concrete blocks phoenixes. Each one stood over 60 feet tall, designed to be sunk in shallow water to form a breakwater. The Americans built the floating piers, whales, articulated steel roadways that could flex with the waves. And the pier heads, mounted on massive spud legs, could raise and lower with the tide, allowing trucks and tanks to drive straight from ship to shore. In total, 2 complete Mulberry Harbors would be created: Mulberry A for the Americans off Omaha Beach, and Mulberry B for the British off Gold Beach. "It's madness," one Royal Navy officer muttered, as a Phoenix section groaned under its own weight. "Madness," another replied. "Perhaps, but it's British madness, and that usually works." As night fell, the final order came through from Admiral Bertram Ramsay, commander of the Naval Invasion Force. The Mulberry components were to depart at first light. Hundreds of tugs would pull their loads across 80 miles of sea through waters that would, within hours, become the deadliest battlefield on Earth. Men clung to the rails as the tugs strained against their cargoes. The great phoenixes moved slowly, almost majestically, through the channel mist. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries lost in the drone of engines. Some of the sailors whispered that the sea itself seemed to hold its breath. They didn't know that a storm, one of the worst channel tempests in decades, was already brewing far to the west. June 7th, 1944. Off the coast of Normandy, the beaches of Normandy were chaos. The smell of cordite and diesel hung heavy in the air. Wrecked landing craft littered the tide line, their twisted hulls half buried in sand and blood. Yet behind this brutal tableau, an astonishing sight began to take shape on the horizon. From the morning haze came the silhouettes of hundreds of strange shapes: concrete giants, steel causeways, and floating pontoons towed slowly toward the newly won beaches by British and American tugboats. Each carried a piece of what the Germans would soon call the Miracle Port. On Omaha Beach, where American forces of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions still fought to secure their positions, engineers from the U.S. Navy's 108th Naval Construction Battalion began to anchor the first Phoenix caissons into place. Giant chains clanked as explosives were set to scuttle them in a precise line offshore. When the charges blew, the sea erupted in columns of foam. Slowly, the concrete hulks sank upright, locking into position like pieces of a colossal jigsaw puzzle. The ocean swirled and steadied, and a line of artificial breakwaters began to rise from the depths. Further east, off Gold Beach, the British Royal Engineers and the Royal Navy construction battalions mirrored the effort. Under shellfire and threat of Luftwaffe attack, they drove the first pier spuds into the seabed and began connecting the whale roadways that would soon stretch from ship to shore. "Steady on the winch," a British petty officer yelled as waves crashed over his boots. "If this link bends, the whole bloody bridge goes with it." Piece by piece, the dream of Hugh Iris Hughes and his team took form. By June 9th, just 3 days after D-Day, the outlines of both Mulberry Harbors were visible from the air. Reconnaissance photos showed a sprawling lattice of structures, breakwaters, floating piers, and anchored ships forming protective arms against the tide. The soldiers called them the cities on the sea. By June 12th, the first supply ships were docking at Mulberry Bay, unloading trucks, tanks, and fuel drums directly onto the beaches. For the first time in history, a full-scale port had been built not on land, but on the open water, under enemy fire. On the deck of a Liberty ship, Captain John D. Jack Riley watched jeeps roll down the floating causeway and shook his head in disbelief. "We've built a port out of thin air," he murmured, "and the tide obeys us." But nature, as the Allies would soon learn, was not so easily commanded. June 18, 1944, Normandy coast. For 12 days, the Mulberry Harbors had worked beyond expectation. Nearly 20,000 vehicles, 100,000 tons of supplies, and countless men had crossed the floating causeways. Allied momentum was building. Commanders toasted the engineers. Newspapers back home hailed the ports that defied the sea. Then, the wind began to change. At first, it was a whisper, a stiffening breeze that whipped sand into the faces of the soldiers unloading trucks on Omaha Beach. By midnight, the whisper had become a roar. The barometer plummeted. The English Channel, normally treacherous even in calm weather, began to churn with a fury unseen in years. By dawn on June 19th, a full-blown gale lashed the coast. Waves as high as 15 feet pounded the fragile network of pontoons, bridges, and caissons. Tugboats strained at their moorings. Men clung to railings as floating roadways twisted underfoot like serpents. "Cut the tow lines! She's breaking loose!" someone screamed over the wind. At Mulberry Bay, the American harbor off Omaha, disaster struck. One by one, the Phoenix caissons shifted under the relentless surf. The great concrete walls cracked open, flooding the protected bay. Pierheads tore free, smashing into each other like drifting icebergs. Trucks and tanks were swept into the sea. By the second night, Mulberry Bay was gone, destroyed beyond repair. At Gold Beach, the British Mulberry Bay fought on. The engineers had driven their spud legs deeper, reinforcing the piers and anchoring ships as makeshift breakwaters. They worked through the storm, waist-deep in freezing water, hammering, welding, praying. When the tempest finally subsided on June 22nd, the beach was littered with wreckage. But the British harbor still stood battered, yet functional. Its breakwaters had held. Its floating roadways, though twisted and scarred, could still bear the weight of supply trucks. General Bernard Montgomery visited the site days later, stepping carefully across the trembling steel plates. He turned to the soaked and exhausted engineers beside him. "Gentlemen," he said, "you have done the impossible twice." Mulberry Bay became the lifeline of Normandy, renamed Port Winston in honor of Churchill. From its decks poured everything needed to sustain the Allied push: food, fuel, ammunition, and hope. Even as Omaha's harbor lay in ruins, the surviving British installation carried the weight of two armies. Over the next 10 months, it would land 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies, an achievement no conventional port could have matched under wartime conditions. The men who built it would never forget the storm. Nor would they forget that the survival of one harbor, one engineering gamble had kept the invasion alive. July 1944. Gold Beach, Normandy. The sun rose pale and golden over the wreckage of war. The beaches that had once run red with blood now hummed with the rhythm of victory. Columns of trucks rumbled down the steel roadways of Port Winston, carrying supplies inland toward Caen and Saint-Lô, where the front lines were pushing deeper into France. Standing at the end of one of the floating piers, Major Alan Beckett, the British engineer who had designed the flexible whale roadways, watched the movement with quiet pride. His steel causeways, held together by nothing more than pins, hinges, and ingenuity, were still carrying the lifeblood of an army. "They said the sea would never let us build here," he murmured to a nearby CB officer. The American grinned. "Guess we forgot to ask her permission." The Mulberry Harbor was more than a feat of engineering. It was the embodiment of Allied cooperation. British planners had conceived it, American shipyards had built it, Canadian tugs had towed it, and multinational crews had assembled it under fire. In that unity of purpose lay the strength that would ultimately crush the Axis. Through the summer and autumn of 1944, the harbor became a living organism, constantly repaired, expanded, adapted. When storms returned, men patched the pontoons with scrap steel. When bombers threatened, they camouflaged the piers with smoke screens. Every truck that crossed those trembling bridges brought the Allies 1 mile closer to Berlin. By October 1944, as the port of Antwerp came into Allied hands, the need for Mulberry diminished. Sections of the harbor were dismantled, others were left to the tide. Yet the skeleton of Port Winston remained, half submerged in the shallows of Arromanches, a silent monument to the moment when human imagination defied the elements. Years later, as peace returned to Europe, fishermen and tourists would gaze at the ghostly concrete blocks offshore and wonder what stories they held. Few would know that beneath the waves lay the remains of the very structures that turned the tide of the war. And for the men who had built them, the welders from Liverpool, the Seabees from New Jersey, the engineers from Wales, the memory endured. They remembered the storm, the exhaustion, the disbelief in their comrades' eyes when the first ships docked safely on that floating steel highway. "We didn't just build a harbor," one veteran later said, "we built the bridge to freedom." From the ashes of Dunkirk to the beaches of Normandy, the Allies had learned that courage alone could win battles, but engineering genius could win wars. The Mulberry Harbors stood as proof that victory was not only forged by soldiers in the trenches, but by men with pencils, blueprints, and a refusal to accept the word impossible. The tide recedes at Arromanches. The sun glints off the remaining concrete caissons. And somewhere beneath the rolling surf, the echoes of D-Day still whisper a reminder that when the world needed a miracle, engineers built one.